Imagine a king so powerful he commanded armies, yet so fragile he believed he was made of glass. For 30 years, his entire court walked on tiptoes, terrified that a single loud noise would shatter their monarch into 1,000 pieces. But on his deathbed, his personal physician, weary of the decades-long charade, approached him not with medicine, but with a small ivory hammer. The 28th of January in the year 1393 would forever be seared into the annals of history as the night of the Ball of the Burning Men. Within the grand hall of the Hotel St. Paul, torchlight danced across stone walls, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed and swayed to the music of lutes and viols. The air was thick with the scent of wine, sweat, and expensive perfumes, a heady mixture of courtly revelry. This masquerade was the decree of the Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, a woman known for her love of lavish festivities. The occasion was a happy one, the remarriage of one of her ladies-in-waiting, a widow finding new joy. The spirit of the night was one of jest and disguise, an opportunity for the nobility of France to shed their stately personas and embrace the absurd, if only for a few fleeting hours. King Charles VI, his mind a precarious vessel already showing cracks, conceived of a spectacle of his own. He and 5 of his closest companions, young and reckless lords of his generation, would disguise themselves as wild men of the forest. The idea seized him with a feverish excitement, a brief, manic burst of light in the encroaching shadows of his psyche. They would be unrecognizable, a true mystery for the court to solve. Their costumes were a feat of foolish ingenuity. Linen garments were sewn to fit them like a second skin, then smeared with a thick layer of flammable pitch to which was stuck a coat of frayed hemp, giving them the shaggy appearance of beasts. To complete the illusion of a savage herd, they were chained together at the ankles, a theatrical flourish that would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. No one considered the danger of the open flames that lit the hall. Their entrance was a shock of calculated chaos. They burst into the hall howling and grunting, their shaggy forms leaping and dancing with a wild, untamed energy. The courtiers, startled at first, soon broke into laughter and applause. The game began, with masked ladies and gentlemen circling the strange creatures, trying to discern the noble faces hidden beneath the matted hemp and sticky pitch. The king reveled in his anonymity, his voice joining the guttural chorus of his companions. He was not a monarch bearing the weight of a kingdom, but a nameless monster in the dark, free and unburdened. The jest was a success. The identity of the 6 savages remained a tantalizing secret, their frantic dance the centerpiece of the Queen's magnificent ball. As the night deepened, the king's brother, Louis, the Duke of Orleans, arrived late from a tavern, his face flushed with wine and his judgment clouded. He was accompanied by his own retinue, all carrying torches to light their way. Hearing the commotion and seeing the bizarre spectacle, the Duke's curiosity was piqued. He pushed through the crowd, determined to unmask the performers. He grabbed one of the dancers, trying to peer through the thick costume. In his drunken impatience, he brought his torch far too close. A single stray spark, no larger than a firefly, leaped from the flame to the dry, pitch-soaked hemp of the man's leg. The effect was not gradual, it was immediate and explosive. A whoosh of sound filled the hall as the man was instantly engulfed in a pillar of fire. The laughter in the great hall died in a collective gasp, replaced by a wave of screams. Before anyone could react, the flames, hungry and swift, leaped to the next man in the chain. The pitch acted as a potent fuel, and in seconds, 5 of the 6 wild men were transformed into living pyres. Their feigned howls of savagery became genuine shrieks of unimaginable agony. Panic erupted. The nobles, moments before engaged in frivolous games, now scrambled away from the horrific inferno at the center of the room. The air filled with the sickening stench of burning pitch, hair, and flesh. The chains that had been part of the jest now became instruments of death, binding the men together in their fiery torment, preventing any hope of escape. 4 of the king's companions were consumed by the blaze, their bodies collapsing into a charred, unrecognizable heap on the stone floor. The king himself, who had been at the end of the chain, felt the searing heat as the flames began to lick at his own costume. He thrashed wildly, his mind snapping under the weight of the terror, his own screams joining the cacophony. It was the young Duchess of Berry, Joan II, who saved him. With a presence of mind that belied her years, she ran forward and threw the heavy velvet train of her gown over the king, smothering the flames just as they began to take hold of him. She pressed down, cutting off the air until the last embers on his costume were extinguished. When the chaos subsided, The music had been replaced by the sobs of the courtiers and the crackling of the last dying flames. The king stood, trembling and unburnt, but staring with vacant eyes at the grotesque scene before him. 4 of his dearest friends were gone, reduced to blackened shapes on the floor of the once joyful hall. The fire that night did more than kill 4 men. It burned away the final, fragile threads of King Charles's sanity. The sight, the sounds, the smell of that horrific moment would haunt him for the rest of his days, a permanent, searing brand upon his soul. The masquerade was over, but for the King of France, the true madness had only just begun. In the aftermath of the ball, the smoke cleared from the great hall, but it seemed to settle permanently within the king's mind. The horror of that night did not fade with the light of day. Instead, it became a seed from which a dark and thorny madness grew, its tendrils wrapping ever tighter around his reason. The king France had known was gone, left behind in the cinders of his friends. The malady did not consume him all at once. It was a tide, receding and advancing with a terrible, unpredictable rhythm. There were days, even weeks, when the waters would pull back, leaving him stranded on the shores of a fragile sanity. During these times, he was himself again, a monarch burdened by the memory of fire and the fear of its return. These moments of lucidity were a special kind of torture. He would see the fear in the eyes of his wife, Isabeau, and the cautious way his own children approached him. He would pore over state documents, trying to grasp the threads of a kingdom that unraveled a little more with each of his descents into darkness. He understood what was happening, and that knowledge was the cruelest blow of all. But the tide always turned. The lucidity would fray at the edges, his thoughts becoming tangled and strange. A word would fall out of place, a memory would vanish. A creeping paranoia would whisper to him from the shadows of the room. The courtiers learned to recognize the signs, the slight glaze in his eyes, the twitch in his hand. The king was leaving them again. When the madness returned, it wore different masks. Sometimes it was a creature of pure, unbridled fury. A servant dropping a silver platter could unleash a storm. He would overturn massive oak tables laden with food and wine, his roars echoing through the stone corridors. He shattered priceless Venetian mirrors with his bare fists, not seeming to feel the pain. During these rages, no one was safe. He saw enemies in the faces of his most loyal advisors, assassins in the movements of his own guards. The court would scatter before him, a flock of terrified birds fleeing a predator. They would lock themselves in their chambers, waiting for the tempest in the king's soul to pass, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Then, just as suddenly, the rage would spend itself, leaving behind a terrifying emptiness. The violent monarch would be replaced by a hollow man, a vacant shell. He would sit for hours in a high-backed chair, staring at a tapestry on the wall, his eyes seeing nothing. His body was present, but his spirit had journeyed to some desolate, unreachable place. In this state of profound apathy, the world ceased to exist for him. Queen Isabeau would kneel before him, her hands on his, her voice pleading for some sign of recognition. His children would be brought to him, their small faces etched with confusion and sorrow. He would look through them as if they were made of glass, his own family becoming ghosts in his presence. The physicians came and went, offering potions and prayers, each with a new theory for the king's affliction. They bled him, purged him, and recited exorcisms, all to no avail. The madness mocked their efforts, shifting its form, ever elusive. It was a phantom that could not be caught, an illness of the soul that resisted all mortal cures. At times, his mind would construct an entirely new reality for itself. For several months, he became convinced that he was not the king at all. He refused to answer to his title, insisting with a calm, unshakable certainty that his name was George. He claimed he had no family, no crown, and no kingdom to rule. He would patiently explain to his bewildered ministers that they had mistaken him for someone else. He denied his own coat of arms, pushing away documents that bore the royal seal. This delusion was more unnerving than his rage. The quiet conviction with which he inhabited this fiction was a chilling testament to how completely his identity had fractured. When not lost in these waking dreams or frozen in apathy, a frantic, nervous energy would possess him. He would begin to pace, an endless, restless march through the sprawling corridors of the Hotel St. Paul. From dawn until long after dusk, the sound of his footsteps would echo through the palace, a metronome marking the time of his torment. He could not bear to be still, as if some unseen terror was chasing him. He would walk for hours, his head bowed, his hands clasped behind his back, never speaking, never stopping. The palace servants learned the sound of his approach and would flatten themselves into alcoves, terrified of crossing his path. He would not harm them, but the sight of his haunted procession was more than they could bear. The palace, once a vibrant heart of the kingdom, became a somber prison. Laughter was a rare and whispered thing. Music was seldom played, for no one knew what sound might trigger the king's next transformation. The court moved with a hushed, fearful reverence, as if they were all living within a cathedral that housed a volatile and unpredictable god. And as the king wandered the labyrinths of his own mind, the kingdom of France began to crumble. His powerful and rapacious uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy and Berry, saw their opportunity. With the throne effectively empty, they moved to consolidate their power, their personal ambitions eclipsing any loyalty to the crown or the good of the realm. The court split into factions, a nest of vipers where intrigue was the common tongue. Alliances were forged and broken, taxes were levied for personal gain, and the business of the state ground to a halt. The English, sensing the weakness, renewed their aggressions, and the long, bloody war between the two nations flared anew. The king's private agony became the public agony of his people. The chaos in his head was a mirror, reflecting the growing chaos across the land. France was a ship without a captain, tossed on the waves of civil strife and foreign invasion. Its monarch, the one man meant to be its anchor, was lost in a storm from which there was no escape. His mind had become the kingdom's darkest territory. One morning, the sun rose over a sleeping Paris, its pale winter light creeping through the tall, arched windows of the Louvre. It found the king in his bed, but it did not find him at peace. He awoke not from a nightmare of fire and screaming, but to a new and chillingly lucid conviction. It was a truth that settled upon him not with the fog of a dream, but with the cold, hard clarity of ice. He sat up, but his movement was unnaturally slow, deliberate, and filled with a strange new caution. He looked at his hands, turning them over in the morning light. He no longer saw flesh and bone, but something else entirely. He saw a substance that was clear, brittle, and terrifyingly fragile. He knew with absolute certainty, made of glass. The realization was not accompanied by a scream or a cry, but by a profound and silent terror. This was a new phase of his malady, more specific and more insidious than any that had come before. It was a delusion with its own unassailable logic. If he was glass, then any sudden impact, any careless touch, could be his end. He was a vessel that could be shattered. When his attendants entered to dress him, he recoiled with a sharp hiss of fear, holding up his hands to ward them off. He forbade them to approach, his voice a strained whisper. He explained, with the desperate patience of one stating an obvious but ignored fact, that his body was no longer made of common matter. He was glass, and they must not touch him. The initial confusion on their faces quickly turned to stunned horror. This was not the familiar rage or the distant apathy they had grown accustomed to. This was a calm, articulate madness, a precisely constructed fantasy that had completely replaced his reality. They stood frozen, unsure of how to dress a king who might break if they laid a hand on him. This new belief dictated a whole new set of rules for his existence. He refused to be bathed or changed by his servants. The very thought of another person's hands on his vitreous skin sent tremors of panic through him. He would remain in his nightclothes, a prisoner of his own terrifying fragility, until a solution could be found. The solution he devised was as strange as the affliction itself. He summoned the royal tailor, a man accustomed to working with silks and velvets, and gave him an order that made the man's blood run cold. He commanded that his clothing be reinforced. Iron rods were to be sewn into the lining of all his garments, creating a protective cage around his brittle form. The tailor and his apprentices worked with trembling hands, their needles piercing the fine fabrics to stitch in the cold, hard metal. They created bizarre hybrid garments, a doublet of rich brocade with an iron corset, velvet robes weighted and stiffened with a metal framework. The king was being fitted for a suit of armor against the world itself. Once encased in his new attire, his movements became even more restricted. The weight of the metal forced him into a stiff, upright posture. He walked with a slow, shuffling gait, his arms held slightly away from his body, like a doll. Each step was a carefully considered act, a negotiation with the terrifying possibility of collapse. The world outside his body became a landscape of constant threat. The sound of a servant's footsteps echoing down the hall was no longer just a noise, it was a percussive shockwave traveling through the stone floor, a vibration that he felt resonate in his glass bones, threatening to splinter him from the feet up. He commanded that the floors of his chambers be covered in thick tapestries and rugs to dampen any sound. Doors were to be opened and closed with excruciating slowness. The boisterous life of the court was silenced. An oppressive quiet fell over the Louvre, the kind of quiet found not in a palace, but in a tomb. He would spend countless hours sitting perfectly still in a large, reinforced chair, his body rigid, his eyes wide with fear. He would follow a sunbeam as it moved across the room, imagining it was a probe searching for imperfections in his crystalline structure, a fatal flaw that could lead to a catastrophic fracture. Even his own family became a source of peril. When Queen Isabeau approached, desperate to offer some comfort, he would cry out for her to stay back. The loving touch she longed to give him was, in his mind, a potential act of destruction. He was utterly alone, isolated by a delusion so complete that it turned love into a weapon. His children were kept from him, their youthful energy and unpredictable movements now representing the gravest of dangers. He would watch them from a distance, his heart aching with a sorrow he could not articulate, a glass father who could not hold his own flesh and blood for fear of being shattered by their embrace. He refused to sit at the council table, convinced that an impassioned minister might strike the table for emphasis and send a fatal vibration through it. State affairs were conducted at a shout, with his advisers standing at the far end of the room, their petitions and reports echoing in the cavernous space. France now had a monarch who ruled from a state of suspended terror. The Louvre was no longer a seat of power but a meticulously curated museum for a single, living exhibit. The king was a precious, fragile object, a man of glass trapped within an iron cage of his own design, waiting for the inevitable impact that would break him into 1,000 pieces. The king's new reality imposed itself upon the entire court, descending like a thick, sound-dampening shroud. The vibrant, often chaotic, life of the Louvre ceased. It was replaced by a strained and suffocating quiet, an atmosphere of collective dread. The horror was not loud, but was felt in the sudden absence of all normal sound. Silence became the new protocol, fear the new master of ceremonies. Courtiers who once strode through the halls with the clatter of swords and spurs now learned to glide like specters. Ladies gathered their heavy silk and velvet skirts to prevent them from rustling against the stone floors. Laughter died in the throat before it could be born. Every action was premeditated to minimize noise. Guards at their posts stood like statues, foregoing the habitual shifting of their weight that would make their armor creak. In the kitchens, cooks placed pots and pans down with the care of a librarian handling ancient scrolls. The palace was holding its breath, terrified to exhale. This shared anxiety created a bizarre, unspoken choreography. People communicated with exaggerated gestures and mouthed words across rooms. A dropped book or a stifled cough could cause a dozen heads to turn, their eyes wide with a synchronized flash of panic, followed by a wave of relief when the king, in his distant chamber, did not scream. At the silent heart of this frozen world sat the king himself. For most of the day, he was a figure of absolute stillness, enthroned in his specially reinforced chair. He had mastered the art of immobility, his body held in a state of rigid tension, his gaze fixed on some indeterminate point on the opposite wall. The iron rods sewn into his doublet and hose gave him a strange, puppet-like silhouette. It was a cage of his own making, a physical manifestation of his internal prison. His face was a mask of perpetual, low-grade terror, his eyes scanning the room for the slightest hint of a threat, for the careless gesture that would be his undoing. He perceived the world as a series of potential impacts. A fly buzzing near the window was not an insect, but a tiny, unpredictable missile. The shudder of a passing carriage on the street below was a seismic event. His existence was a constant, exhausting vigil against the physics of a world that had become hostile to his fragile form. The business of the realm could not accommodate such fragility. Governance, which relies on discourse, debate, and the presence of the monarch, ground to a halt. The great council chamber, where the fate of France was once decided, fell silent. Dust began to settle on the long oak table, a fine grey powder on the seat of the king's empty chair. Emissaries from foreign lands arrived only to be met with polite, firm refusal at the palace gates. They carried messages of alliance, of war, of trade, but their words never reached the royal ear. France was becoming a ghost kingdom, a nation without a voice, its king too brittle to hear the knocking at his own door. Scrolls and dispatches from generals and regional administrators piled up in the chancellery, their wax seals unbroken. Pleas for funds, reports of English troop movements, and petitions from starving towns went unread. The nervous system of the kingdom was severed at its head, and the body was beginning to twitch and spasm. Into this void of authority, the king's uncles stepped with practiced ease. Louis of Orleans, John of Berry, and Philip of Burgundy saw not a tragedy but an opportunity. The king's madness was the key that unlocked the treasury and the power of the throne, and they did not hesitate to use it. They formed a regency council, ostensibly to govern in the king's name during his illness. Their meetings were a performance of grave concern, their voices full of feigned sorrow for their nephew's condition. But behind this facade, they began to methodically dismantle the state for their own enrichment and power. The royal coffers were treated as their personal purse. Taxes were increased, not to fund the army or feed the populace, but to build lavish new castles and pay their private debts. They sold offices, titles, and royal pardons to the highest bidder, turning justice into a commodity and loyalty into a transaction. Loyal ministers and advisers who had served the king for years were systematically dismissed, replaced by sycophants and creatures of the dukes. The court, once a center of culture, was transformed into a nest of intrigue, where allegiance shifted with the promise of gold and land. Every corner had a spy, and every conversation was a potential betrayal. Queen Isabeau, isolated and politically outmaneuvered, was powerless to stop them. She was a witness to the plundering of her husband's kingdom, relegated to the role of a distraught wife whose only duty was to manage the strange and terrifying household of a glassman. Her protests were ignored, her authority undermined at every turn. The paralysis at the court spread like a disease through the arteries of the kingdom. With no central authority to enforce the law, local lords became petty tyrants, waging their own wars and terrorizing the peasantry. Bandits roamed the highways, and commerce between towns dwindled as travel became too dangerous. Garrisons on the English frontier in Aquitaine went unpaid, their numbers dwindling through desertion. Fortifications fell into disrepair. The ever-present threat of the English, who watched the French collapse with keen interest, grew larger with each passing day. The kingdom was rotting from within, inviting invasion. And all the while, the king sat in his iron-laced clothes, oblivious to the dismemberment of his realm. He was engaged in a far more immediate and personal war, a battle against sound, against movement, against the very air he breathed. His duty was not to France, but to the preservation of his own fragile, crystalline form. His body was a crystal prison, but that prison now encompassed the entire kingdom of France. Every subject was now an inmate, trapped by the consequences of his delusion. The slow, inexorable shattering the king feared for himself was already happening to his country, piece by falling piece. The years bled into one another, each one a little grayer, a little colder than the last. The seasons turned outside the palace walls, but within, time itself seemed to have congealed. The king's madness was the only calendar, its cycles of storm and calm the only measure of the passing days. The court grew old with him, their faces slowly etched with the same weariness that clung to the stone. The glass delusion, which had held him in its terrifying grip for so long, did not vanish in an instant. It receded like a slow tide, leaving behind strange pools of clarity. He would wake some mornings and the certainty of his brittleness would be less sharp, more of a question than a fact. He would dare to move a limb, and be surprised when it did not crack. These moments were filled with a profound and disorienting confusion. He would look down at his hands, expecting to see translucent fingers, and find only the familiar flesh of a man entering his middle age. He would touch his own face, feeling the rough stubble of his beard, and the sensation would be an alien shock, a rediscovery of his own solid form. The iron rods in his clothing, once a comfort, became an absurd and cumbersome burden. He would command his attendants to cut them out, and they would obey with a swift, silent relief. For a day, or a week, or sometimes even a month, Charles would be king again, returned from the strange country of his own mind. These periods of lucidity were not a relief, but a uniquely refined form of torture. With the lifting of the madness came the crushing weight of awareness. He would demand to see the state ledgers, to hear the reports from his council. And with every page turned, with every whispered report, his despair deepened. He saw a treasury bled dry by his uncles, a nobility fractured into warring factions, a peasantry starved by crippling taxes levied in his name. He would read dispatches from the front, tales of humiliating defeats at the hands of the English, of lands lost that his ancestors had fought and died for. He saw his own reflection in a polished silver plate and barely recognized the men who stared back. He saw the haunted, hollowed eyes, the streaks of gray in his hair and beard. He was a king in name only, a broken figurehead on a sinking ship of state. The guilt was a physical weight, heavier than any iron cage. He would try, with a desperate, frantic energy, to reclaim his kingdom. He would summon the council, his voice strong and clear, issuing decrees and outlining strategies. But he saw the way they looked at him, with a mixture of pity and condescension. They would agree to everything, then go and do the bidding of their true masters, the dukes. His attempts to reconnect with his family were just as painful. He would call for his children, now growing into young adults who were strangers to him. He saw their fear, their awkwardness in his presence. They were the children of a madman, and they could not forget it, even when he was sane. His wife, Isabeau, was a ghost, her affection long since turned to duty and exhaustion. And then, inevitably, the tide would begin to turn. It would start subtly, a thread of paranoia weaving its way into his thoughts. A courtier's bow would seem mocking, a servant's whisper a conspiracy. The world would begin to lose its solid edges, the familiar faces around him becoming strange and menacing masks. The terror of knowing it was returning was the worst part. He would fight it, clinging to reason as a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood. But the current was too strong. The darkness would pull him under again, and he would be lost, plunging back into the howling abyss of rage or the silent, gray desert of apathy. It was Queen Isabeau, in a moment of final, weary desperation, who brought the girl to him. Her name was Odette de Champdivers, the daughter of a minor noble. She was young, quiet, and possessed a preternatural calm. She was not brought to be a lover, but a keeper, a last, desperate attempt at a human anchor. When she first entered his chambers, the king was in one of his vacant moods, a statue in a chair. She did not approach him with the fear or the false reverence of the others. She simply curtsied, then sat on a stool a respectable distance away, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. She did not speak. She simply shared his silence. Her presence was a balm. She asked nothing of him. Day after day, she would return, sometimes bringing a book of poetry from which she would read in a low, even voice. She never flinched when he began to mutter to himself, nor did she react when he suddenly fell silent for hours. She was a rock of tranquility in his chaotic world. It was Odette who introduced him to the cards. She brought a beautifully painted deck, the kings and queens and knaves rendered in bright colors and gold leaf. She taught him the simple rules of a game of chance, an activity with a clear and simple structure. It was something his fractured mind could grasp. They would play for hours, the only sound the soft flick of the cards on the heavy oak table. For the king, the game was a refuge. Within the fixed rules and the turn of the cards, there was a predictable order that his life lacked. He did not have to be a king or a madman, he only had to be a player. Odette became his only true companion, the one person who could navigate the treacherous corridors of his moods. The court, with a mixture of scorn and relief, began to call her La Petite Reine, the Little Queen. She was the queen of his shrunken, cloistered world, and her reign was one of quiet patience. In time, their relationship deepened. In his lucid moments, he found in her a confidant who listened without judgment. In his darkest periods, her hand on his was the only touch he could bear. She gave him a daughter, a small, perfect child named Margaret, a testament to the brief moments of peace she had brought him. He was holding the infant on a rare good day, looking down at her tiny, sleeping face. But there was no recognition in his eyes, no flicker of fatherly pride. He was looking at her as he looked at the painted queen in his hand of cards, a beautiful and curious object, but something fundamentally separate from himself. Meanwhile, beyond the padded walls of the king's chambers, France was tearing itself apart. The assassination of his brother, Louis of Orleans, on the orders of his cousin, John the Fearless of Burgundy, plunged the nation into open civil war. The factions of Armagnac and Burgundian slaughtered each other in the streets of Paris. The English king, Henry V, saw his chance. He landed an army in Normandy, and at a place called Agincourt, he annihilated the flower of French nobility. The news of the catastrophic defeat filtered back to the palace, another report of a world on fire, a world the King of France could no longer reach. He simply turned over another card. The end did not come as a shadow in the mind, the familiar phantom that had haunted him for decades. It arrived as a fire in the blood, a baser, more common enemy. A fever, born of the damp autumn air, had taken root in the king's weary body. It was a simple, brutish illness, an ague that paid no mind to crowns or delusions. It had come to claim the physical shell of a man whose spirit had been broken long ago. On the 21st of October in the year 1422, the great clock of the kingdom was ticking its final seconds for King Charles VI. He lay upon his deathbed in the Hotel St. Paul, not the Grand Louvre, a palace he had long since abandoned. The room was vast and cold, the tapestries on the wall seeming to absorb the weak candlelight, giving nothing back. He was not surrounded by the powerful men who had governed in his name. His rapacious uncles were dead, and their sons were busy carving up what remained of France. Queen Isabeau was absent, her presence in his life having faded to a political formality years ago. The court, that great constellation of ambition, had already shifted its gaze toward the rising sun of the Dauphin. The King of France died in a profound and cavernous solitude. His only companions in that final watch were a handful of aging servants, men whose loyalty had outlasted power, wealth, and reason itself. And at his side, holding a cool cloth to his fevered brow, was Odette de Champdivers, the little queen, her face a pale, sorrowful moon in the gloom. He thrashed weakly beneath the heavy linens, his body consumed by alternating waves of burning heat and bone-rattling chills. His mind, already a shattered landscape, was now further ravaged by delirium. He muttered broken phrases, names of men long dead, words from a battle fought 30 years before. The fire of the burning men seemed to flicker one last time behind his dying eyes. Odette spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, the way one would speak to a frightened child. She offered him sips of water that he could not take. She was the final, gentle note in the violent symphony of his life, a testament to a kindness he had rarely known and had been incapable of returning. Her quiet grief was the only true mourning in the room. Into this hushed and somber scene, the heavy oak door creaked open. The movement was so slow, so deliberate, that it barely registered. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway for a moment before stepping into the candlelight. It was the court physician, an old man now, his back stooped from decades of bowing to nobles and to the king's madness. He had served Charles for nearly his entire reign. He had been a young, ambitious man when he had first been called to treat the king after the incident in the forest of Le Mans. He had spent a lifetime prescribing useless herbs, overseeing pointless bleedings, and attempting to reason with a mind that had sealed itself off from the world. He moved toward the bed with a steady, unhurried gait. Odette looked up, her eyes weary, assuming he had come to administer some final, futile tonic. The old physician offered her a thin, professional smile that did not reach his eyes, and he gestured for her to step aside. She did so, her duty giving way to the authority of medicine. The physician carried no vials, no pouches of herbs. In his right hand, he held a small object that glinted with a soft, milky sheen in the candlelight. It was a percussion hammer, the kind a physician might use to test a patient's reflexes, but this one was exquisitely crafted from a single piece of polished ivory. It was small, elegant, and perfectly weighted. He stood over the king, looking down at the dying man's face. He saw the slack jaw, the sweat-soaked gray hair plastered to the scalp, the eyes rolling blindly beneath fluttering lids. This was the man who had held the entire court, the entire kingdom, hostage to his phantoms. This was the man whose terrors had become the laws of the palace. The physician remembered the years of walking on eggshells, of speaking in whispers for fear a normal tone might shatter the royal psyche. He recalled the humiliation of having to solemnly agree that his king was made of glass, of having to devise absurd protocols to protect a body that was merely flesh and blood. He remembered the fear. The sudden, explosive rages that could be triggered by a misplaced spoon. The terrifying emptiness of the king's apathy. He, a man of science and reason, had been forced to live inside a fairy tale, a dark and nonsensical story written by a madman. And he had come to hate the author with a cold, patient fury that had smoldered for 30 years. His actions were fluid, born of long rehearsal in the privacy of his own thoughts. He raised the small ivory hammer. There was no malice in his expression, only a detached, clinical curiosity. He was finally going to conduct the experiment that had been denied him for decades. He was going to test the material properties of the king. With a calm, precise motion, he brought the hammer down, striking the king squarely on the forehead. The motion was not savage, but it was firm. It was the tap of a craftsman testing his work, of a geologist testing a stone. The sound it made was not the high, crystalline ring of shattering glass. It was not the dramatic explosion that the king had always feared. It was a dull thud. A soft, fleshy, unremarkable sound. It was the sound of a piece of ivory striking a piece of bone, cushioned by skin and flesh. It was the most ordinary sound in the world. The king's body gave a final, reflexive shudder and then was still. His breath, which had been a ragged, shallow gasp, ceased. The fever had claimed him, but the hammer had punctuated the end of his story. The physician looked down at the now still face of the dead monarch. A slow, thin smile spread across his own lips, a small, tight nod of satisfaction. It was not a smile of joy, but of vindication. This was his payment, his bitter reward for a lifetime of fear and pretense. This was his revenge. It was a quiet, private act of defiance against the men who had forced a whole kingdom to believe in his fragile, crystalline lie, all while remaining stubbornly, infuriatingly, and merely human.